As his mother went into the kitchen to clean up some dishes, Ryan followed her and leaned against the counter so that he could talk to her as she worked. There were so many things that he wanted to ask her, but none of them could be formed into coherent words or sentences when he tried to speak. She looked up at him and smiled at the fact that he was clearly trying to say something but didn't know how. Tossing him a dish towel, she told him that she had wiped his butt when he was a baby, so there wasn't much that he had to worry about saying to her. She told him to just say whatever was on his mind. So he did. He asked her what Grandpa was like. He told her that he remembered bits and pieces, but he didn't really know the man before he died. He said that he knew that his mother didn't like talking about her father, but he wanted to know more about Grandpa. His mother didn't stop cleaning dishes. He could tell that she didn't like the topic that was being brought up, but she didn't get upset at Ryan for asking. Instead, she took some time to carefully think about what she wanted to say, and then she told Ryan that her father was a cold, often cruel man who didn't have an ounce of love to spare for her or her brother. She said that Grandpa was selfish and that he would spend hours sitting by himself while her mother worked her tail off making dinner and helping the kids with their homework. Grandma bought the Christmas and birthday presents. Grandma decorated the tree and hosted the parties. Grandma was a parent to her, while Grandpa hid in his dark little corner, worried only about himself. None of this came as a surprise to Ryan. He had heard his mother talk about her father this way countless times before, but he had never heard any of it from the perspective that he had now. There was undoubtedly more to learn and understand about Grandpa, but would that change anything that mattered? Would it make him a better person, or just explain why he was such a horrible one? As they continued to work, cleaning dishes and putting away leftovers, Ryan's mother told him a story from when she was a young girl, maybe 13 years old. She recalled a year when her little brother Doug had gotten involved with a school production of Peter Pan. Doug put everything he had into that production, ever since the moment he heard which show they would be doing that year. Months before auditions even began, he borrowed the book from the library and read it from cover to cover, learning every line of dialogue. The way his mother told it, Uncle Doug had a memory unlike anyone she had ever known before. The way he could recall information was astonishing, and she and her mother were always floored by this ability. Doug wanted the role of Peter Pan so badly that he even read books about J.M. Barrie so that he would know how the story had come about. At the time, Doug was only 10 or 11 years old, so this level of commitment was impressive. Ryan's mother told him how impressed she and Grandma had been as Doug worked for this role. Grandma even volunteered to sew costumes for the production because she wanted to be there to see her son work on the play. The day that Doug auditioned for the role, he was so excited that he didn't even eat breakfast that morning. He spent his lunchtime reading through the script, even though he'd already known all the lines for weeks. And then he auditioned, and it went wonderfully. Doug was offered the role of Peter Pan that day, and went home to tell his family with such excitement that he couldn't contain himself. After he told his mother and sister, Doug spent an hour pretending to fly around the house while reciting lines to himself, waiting for his father to get home from work so the family could sit down for a celebratory dinner. Eventually, Grandpa came home from work the same way he always did. He walked into the house quietly. Ryan's mother referred to him as a small man with a small life. After Grandpa had put his things away, Doug ran up to him and excitedly told him about his audition and how well it went, and how he had been offered the part right there on the spot, even though Jimmy Waters was standing right there and he really wanted the role too. For a moment, Ryan's mother watched as her father looked down at his son, and she thought that he might have actually been proud of his child for once in his life. She could have sworn that she saw a hint of a smile forming on his lips before the small man's eyes went cold once again. Grandpa didn't congratulate his son on getting the role or hoist the boy onto his shoulders and fly him around the house like any normal, loving father might do. Instead, Grandpa turned away from his son and stared at the window, mumbling to himself about how badly Jimmy Waters must have wanted that role, about how that role had been taken from Jimmy and how he would never know what it was like to be Peter Pan. Poor Jimmy. That's what Ryan's mother remembered about her father. The cold, uncaring, heartless man who offered more concern to everyone else in the world than he did to his own family. As she told the story about her father, Ryan could hear the anger that his mother felt toward Grandpa, as fresh as if it had all happened yesterday. She told him that Doug was such a sweet boy, and he had worked so hard on that play. He gave a wonderful performance, and the audience cheered for him. Even Jimmy Waters was happy for him after a little while. But Grandpa never showed joy for his own son, or pride, No matter how hard Doug worked to gain his father's approval, the small man never gave him an ounce. Ryan's mother told him that Doug never stopped trying. No matter how many times his father let him down, Doug kept wanting there to be more between them. But Grandpa didn't have it to offer. No matter which university Doug got into or which lucrative job Doug got afterward, the story was always the same. Every time she thought that Grandpa might be showing a hint of pride in Doug, a switch would flip and the man would become cold in an instant. He always reminded both of his children what their success meant. It meant that someone else was losing. They were always taking something away from other people just by breathing the air around them. Ryan's mother resented what her father had tried to teach her. She spent years constantly having to remind herself that she deserved what she earned. She put in the work. She wasn't taking anything away from anyone. As a teenager, she hated her father. Seeing how Grandpa treated Doug filled her with rage that she'd spent a lifetime trying to overcome. According to Ryan's mother, Grandpa made her into a worse person than she was. Ryan allowed that comment to sink in, and he was so grateful to have parents who had gone out of their way to make both him and his brother feel as though they were important. He asked his mother if Grandpa was an alcoholic or physically abusive, but she told him that it wasn't like that. He wasn't the victim of a disease that he couldn't overcome. He simply was what he was. She then stopped and held up a finger, as if a memory were just coming back to her, something that would further drive home her point about her father. She told Ryan that Grandpa used to tell his kids to stay out of the basement. It was his space, and he didn't want anyone snooping around down there. Most nights after it got dark outside, Grandpa would go down to the basement and lock the door behind him. If she and her brother listened at the door, they could hear Grandpa down there, listening to a baseball game or hammering away at some project. Sometimes he would make furniture that would end up somewhere else in the house. She did give him credit for making beautiful, strong tables and chairs. It just went to show what kind of patience and care he could put into something, and what he chose to deny his own family. The basement was a mystery to Ryan's mother. Back when she was growing up, parents and kids existed in completely different classes. If your parent told you to do something, you listened to them. If you didn't do what you were told, you'd get a spanking or be grounded for a month. Since she'd been told to stay out of the basement ever since she was a small child, she had never questioned the rule. Daddy's space was Daddy's space, and you didn't dare go down there. It could be dangerous down there. That was what Grandma had always told her and her brother in order to keep them from breaking the rules. If they went downstairs, they could lose a finger, play with matches and they'd burn to death, cross their eyes, and they'd stay that way. But after seeing the way Grandpa treated Doug, and after years of being pushed away, time and time again, Ryan's mother was done listening to the rules. If her father wanted to beat her to a pulp, he was welcome to do it, because at least then she might feel as though she existed to him. So Ryan's mother practiced opening the basement door when her father was at work and her mother was out of the house. She tried picking the lock with a hairpin, but that proved to be much harder than it looked in the movies. She then took one of her parents' old credit cards out of the trash and tried slipping that between the door and its frame. This time it worked. Finally, she knew how to get down into the basement. Now all she needed to do was wait for the right moment. One night, when she thought her parents had both gone out for a walk, Ryan's mother opened the basement door and quietly made her way down the stairs. She didn't even know why she was being quiet, but she did it anyway, because it seemed like the way you were supposed to do something like this. When she finally reached the bottom of the stairs, there was just enough light coming through the basement window to allow her to see the place. She didn't know what she expected to find down there. Maybe she thought that she would find human body parts hanging from the ceiling. Maybe she thought that she would find dirty magazines or a huge gun collection. The basement was none of these things, however. It was just a cold, dark hole in the ground. There were tools neatly stored on shelves or hanging on the wall near a workbench. There were woodworking projects that her father was working on. She remembered walking to one of the shelves and seeing a collection of hand-carved figurines depicting a family that didn't even resemble her own. In one corner of the room there was a chair with yellow and orange fabric on it and a little table nearby. On the table, there was an empty whiskey bottle. Ryan's mother had never seen her father drunk, so she wasn't lying when she said that her father wasn't an alcoholic, but there were clearly times when he would sit by himself down there and drink the rest of the world out of existence. She then told Ryan that as she explored this forbidden but unremarkable basement, she walked closer to the table where the whiskey bottle sat. On the table, she found an old cigarette case. She remembered thinking that it was strange, because her father was one of the few adults she knew who never smoked. But there it was. Ryan's mother closed her eyes as she told him this part of the story, and she moved her hands as if she were still holding that cigarette case. She told Ryan that it wasn't metal like most of the cases that she'd seen other parents carry. This felt like a chunk of stone in her hand, black and polished to a high gloss. Before she had a chance to look it over for engravings or open it and see what was inside, she heard footsteps racing down the stairs behind her. She spun, dropping the cigarette case to the floor just in time to see her father coming toward her. His eyes were filled with a look that she'd never seen in him before. Not rage exactly. It was like panic, but it felt like something more than that to her. As he came toward her, she stood tall and tried to look defiant, as if she wanted to get the beating of her life. Instead, he grabbed the cigarette case from the floor and stuffed it into his pocket. When he stood back up, he was breathing heavily, as if he had just run a race. She could see sweat on his forehead, and his eyes were moving from her to the wall and back again as he thought about how he was going to react. Under his breath, she could hear him mumbling to himself about how she shouldn't have been down there, and then she heard him say that she never should have been born. He hadn't even been speaking to her, and he hadn't even thought about how hurtful those words would be for a child coming from her own father. She told him right there for the first time in her life that she hated him, really, truly hated him, and she too wished that she had never been born as she ran up the stairs in tears. The man couldn't even be bothered to smack her, she told Ryan. In some ways, it would have been easier for her if he had. When Ryan heard that story from his mother, he wasn't sure what he should say next. He didn't know how asking any question could possibly give him more perspective on the man who had sent him a birthday present from beyond the grave, and it certainly didn't explain why Grandpa had chosen to wait until now to do it. What her story did do was remind Ryan, not of what the box contained, but what the box itself looked like on the inside. While the outside of the box had been carefully crafted and polished and was beautiful to look at, the inside was something else entirely. Along the inner lid of the box, Grandpa had scratched words. It didn't look like they had been put there for any artistic reason or with any proper tools. It looked as if someone had carved them into the wood with whatever sharp object was handy at the time. It also looked as if they had been carved at different points, when Grandpa was especially emotional. When Ryan had opened the box, and after he had seen what it contained, he looked at what Grandpa had carved into the wood, and he'd tried to figure out what those words meant. The oldest of them appeared to be the words in the upper left corner of the lid. They were almost neat, as if Grandpa were trying to write a message into the box. But after the first few words, the carvings became irregular. They were carved at all angles, wherever Grandpa could find the space to dig into his creation. They became messy, angry words over the course of what might have been years, though there was no way of knowing how long it had taken or when the box had been made. Ryan supposed that it didn't matter, because the sentiment of those words was the same and echoed what Grandpa had told Ryan's mother that night in the basement. "You shouldn't be here." Those 4 words were dug into the wood again and again, but why? Who were they intended for? Ryan, his mother? Or were they directed at Grandpa himself? Ryan's father had told him that Grandpa was probably full of undiagnosed and untreated mental health issues, and honestly, Ryan couldn't blame him if it were true. Ryan had only seen the contents of that box a few hours earlier, and it was already playing games with his mind. He couldn't imagine what it would have been like to live with something like that for decades, and to know that if anyone else knew about it, everything you cared about could be lost in a heartbeat. According to Ryan's mother, Grandpa didn't seem to care about much, but what if she knew the truth? What if she could put her father into a new context? Would that change things for her, or would knowing only make her life worse? Once her story was over, Ryan asked his mother if she truly did hate her father. She told him that yes, she did. At the time. He asked her if she still hated him, and that's when she grew quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Ryan and said that she was still angry with him. She still wished that things had been different and that he had cared more about his family. But she had spent a long time living with those feelings, and she eventually had to learn to let go of the hatred itself. Everything else was out of her control. They were things that had been done to her and her brother. The hatred was something that she herself was putting out into the world, even if it was only directed at one person. It was ugly. As she had said, her father made her into a worse person than she was. Once he was gone, she couldn't blame him for her own thoughts and feelings. He was the past, and the past was what it was. Ryan had to wonder how much of what she was saying was what she actually felt, and how much of it was what she wanted to feel. He knew that life was more complicated than simply shrugging and letting go of your past. If it were that easy, maybe Grandpa could have been a better father. The conversation had become a bit too serious for Ryan's mother, given the fact that they were supposed to be celebrating his birthday that night, so she put on a big smile and walked to him. She took his face in her hands, and she told him that she loved him. She told him that she was proud of him. She told him that she wouldn't erase 1 ounce of the pain or ugliness that she had seen in her life, because it had all led her to that house and to the family that she valued more than anything in the world. In response to this heartfelt moment, Ryan asked his mother if she'd been dipping into the bourbon icing again, and they both had a good laugh. As he walked out of the kitchen, however, his smile faded just a bit. Those words from the lid of his grandpa's box echoed through his head. "You shouldn't be here." As he stood just outside of the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the house around him, the conversations and the running water, and the TV that was playing some old show from the 80s that his grandma loved so much, Ryan couldn't help but wonder if any of them should be there. Was Grandpa right? Did it even matter if he was right? Because one slip or one mistake and none of them would be there. How does that sort of power not drive a man insane? Then again, maybe it had.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.